The roar of engines filled the European sky as American bombers pushed deep into Nazi territory. For the young airmen on board, every mission meant risking capture if they were shot down. When parachutes blossomed over German fields, survival was only the first step into a new and uncertain reality. Life as a prisoner of war in the heart of Hitler's Reich. For those who fell into German hands, the treatment they received would depend on a complex mix of international law, German resources, and the crumbling fortunes of the Third Reich. Captured American soldiers quickly discovered a stark contrast between myth and reality. Nazi propaganda painted Allied prisoners as brutal invaders deserving of vengeance, and in the immediate chaos of capture, that fury sometimes spilled over. Civilians, enraged by bombings that had leveled their towns, often attacked downed airmen before soldiers intervened. The fate of an American POW could hinge on whether they were taken by the Wehrmacht, the regular German army bound by the Geneva Convention, or by the Gestapo and SS, who operated outside such restraints. Once secured by the Wehrmacht, prisoners typically followed a familiar pattern: a search for intelligence, processing at transit camps, and eventual transfer to a permanent Stalag, the German term for a prisoner of war camp. The first days were marked by interrogation at places like Dulag Luft, where airmen faced skilled officers trained to extract information with a mix of deception and pressure rather than outright torture. For many, these sessions determined not only what the Germans learned, but also how their captors viewed them afterward. The initial shock of capture gave way to an uneasy rhythm of confinement. Behind barbed wire, American POWs entered a world where survival hinged on rations, morale, and the fragile hope of liberation. Life inside German POW camps varied widely, shaped by location, resources, and the stage of the war. Camps like Stalag Luft III, later immortalized by the Great Escape, became temporary homes for thousands of captured American and British airmen. On paper, conditions followed the Geneva Convention. Prisoners were entitled to shelter, food, medical care, and protection from forced labor directly related to the German war effort. In practice, however, daily existence was a constant struggle between meager German supplies and the vital lifeline provided by the International Red Cross. Rations distributed by the Germans were often insufficient, especially as the war dragged on. Black bread mixed with sawdust, thin soup, and occasional scraps of meat left men perpetually hungry. Red Cross parcels, when they arrived, made the difference between starvation and survival. These packages contained tinned meat, chocolate, powdered milk, and cigarettes, items that became currency within the camp. A single can of Spam or a bar of chocolate could be traded for services, favors, or even protection. For many Americans, the parcels not only filled their stomachs, but also reminded them that they were not forgotten. Despite the hardship, prisoners forged communities behind the wire. They built makeshift classrooms, formed theater groups, and organized sports leagues to keep morale alive. In Stalag Luft III, an entire underground network developed to aid escape attempts. Prisoners dug tunnels, forged documents, and crafted civilian clothing from scraps of cloth. These efforts served more than the slim chance of freedom. They gave prisoners a sense of agency in a life otherwise controlled by guards and fences. Yet even in the relative safety of the camps, danger lurked. Harsh punishments awaited those who defied orders, and the shadow of the Gestapo hung over every act of resistance. By 1944, thousands of American soldiers and airmen found themselves scattered across German soil in stalags and offlogs. The wire fences and watchtowers were a daily reminder that escape was nearly impossible, yet the camps were not uniform in character. Some resembled disciplined military installations, where guards and prisoners maintained a wary respect. Others, particularly those under SS influence, carried an atmosphere of cruelty and fear. For the average American POW, Survival was about adapting to the camp's rhythm and finding small victories in a life stripped of freedom. Daily roll calls often stretched into hours, forcing men to stand motionless in bitter cold or driving rain. Barracks, though equipped with bunks and stoves, rarely provided real comfort. Wood for heating was scarce, and overcrowding meant disease spread quickly. Still, camaraderie became a powerful defense. Prisoners shared what little they had, turned boredom into creativity, and found humor even in bleak conditions. Letters from home, when they slipped past censors, provided emotional lifelines. A single envelope, smudged with familiar handwriting, could lift the spirits of an entire barracks. Food remained the constant challenge. As the war dragged Germany toward collapse, parcels grew rarer, and German rations dwindled to near starvation levels. Malnutrition gnawed at strength and morale alike. Yet within this deprivation, prisoners built ingenious systems of barter and mutual support. Cigarettes became currency, tins of powdered milk became treasures. Survival was not just about calories, but about hope, the belief that the war would end and the fences would one day come down. For many Americans, the greatest threat was not bullets or bombs anymore, but the slow erosion of body and spirit. Endurance became the quiet battle fought every day behind the wire. As Germany's military fortunes crumbled in 1945, conditions for American POWs shifted from hardship to desperation. What little order the camps once had began to fracture under the weight of scarcity. Guards who had once enforced discipline with strict precision now struggled to feed themselves, and prisoners often sensed the thin line between authority and collapse. Rumors swept through the barracks, whispers of advancing Allied armies, of German retreats, of liberation drawing near. Yet with every rumor came fear, the possibility that the prisoners might not survive to see the war's end. The greatest ordeal came in the form of the forced marches. With Allied forces pushing from both east and west, the Germans evacuated camps, driving tens of thousands of POWs on foot across frozen landscapes. Exhausted and half-starved, Americans trudged through snow and mud, their boots falling apart, their clothes little protection against the brutal winter. Those who collapsed on the roadside often never rose again. Guards, themselves weary and frightened, sometimes turned a blind eye, sometimes fired warning shots into the air. The marches blurred into endless days, the only measure of progress the silhouettes of towns passed in the distance. Yet even in those grueling columns, resilience persisted. Prisoners supported one another, sharing scraps, carrying the weakest, whispering promises of survival. A small crust of bread divided among 3 men, or the steadying arm of a comrade, meant the difference between despair and endurance. For many, these marches became etched as the darkest chapter of captivity, proof that the final months of war could be as cruel as any battlefield. When liberation finally came, it arrived with the suddenness of a dream. American tanks rolling into view, guards fleeing, and fences left unlocked. Starving and exhausted men staggered into freedom, forever changed by what they had endured. Freedom was not the end of the story for America's prisoners. Liberation delivered them from the wire, but the scars of captivity traveled home with them. When the gates swung open and soldiers stepped into the arms of liberating forces, relief often mixed with disbelief. Some were too weak to cheer, others too stunned to comprehend that the ordeal was over. Emaciated faces, hollow eyes, and ragged uniforms spoke more than words ever could. They were alive, but they had paid dearly for survival. Returning home, many struggled to explain what life inside the camps had been like. Families wanted celebration, yet the memories carried by these men were heavy with hunger, cold, and the constant presence of death. Some recounted the cruel marches through snow and mud. Others spoke of friendships forged in the darkest hours, bonds so strong they felt closer than blood. Many chose silence, unwilling or unable to relive the days of confinement. Their resilience became a quiet legacy, remembered not through grand monuments, but through the simple fact that they endured. Looking back, the treatment of American POWs in German camps reveals the contradictions of the war itself. Under the Wehrmacht, many camps followed the Geneva Convention, offering a rough framework of order and survival. Yet as resources dwindled and the Nazi regime collapsed, cruelty and neglect overshadowed law. Survival depended on parcels from distant strangers, on the kindness of fellow prisoners, and on the stubborn refusal to surrender hope. The story of these men is not only one of suffering, but of endurance. Stripped of freedom, starved and marched through winter, they clung to life until freedom came again. Their journey reminds us that even in captivity, the human spirit can endure more than barbed wire, hunger, or fear could ever confine.